Peggy Terry and her mother, Mary Owsley. It is a crowded apartment uptown, a Chicago area in which many of the southern white emigres live, furnished flats in most instances. Young people from the neighborhood wander in and out casually. The flow of visitors is constant. Occasionally, a small, raggedly clothed boy shuffles in, stares, vanishes. Peggy Terry is known in these parts as a spokesman for the poor southern whites. Hillbillies are up here for a few years and they get their guts kicked out and they realize their white skin doesn't mean what they always thought it meant. Mrs. Owsley is the first to tell her story. Kentucky-born, she married an Oklahoma boy when he came back from World War I. He was so restless and disturbed from the war, we just drifted back and forth. It was a constant shifting from Oklahoma to Kentucky and back again, 3, 4 times the route. He saw the tragedies of war so vividly that he was discontented everywhere. From 1929 to 1936, they lived in Oklahoma. There was thousands of people out of work in Oklahoma City. They set up a soup line, and the food was clean and it was delicious. Many, many people, colored and white. I didn't see any difference, because there was just as many white people out of work than were colored. Lost everything they had accumulated from their young days. And these are facts. I remember several families had to leave in covered wagons. To California, I guess. See, the oil boom came in '29. People come from every direction there. A couple of years later, they was living in everything from pup tents, houses built out of cardboard boxes and old pieces of metal that they'd pick up, anything that they could find to put something together, to put a wall around them to protect them from the public. I knew one family there in Oklahoma City, a man and a woman and several children lived in a hole in the ground. You'd be surprised how nice it was, how nice they kept it. They had chairs and tables and beds back in that hole. And they had all the dirt braced up there, just like a cave. Oh, the dust storms. They were terrible. You could wash and hang clothes on a line, and if you happened to be away from the house and couldn't get those clothes in before the storm got there, you'd never wash that out. Oil was in that sand. It had colored them the most awful color you ever saw. It just ruined them. They was just never fit to use, actually. I had to use them, understand, but they wasn't very presentable. Before my husband was laid off, we lived in a good home. It wasn't a brick house, but it wouldn't have made any difference. These storms, when they would hit, you had to clean house from the attic to the ground. Everything was covered in sand, red sand, just full of oil. The majority of people were hit and hit hard. They were mentally disturbed, you're bound to know, because they didn't know when the end of all this was coming. There was a lot of suicides that I know of. From nothing else but just they couldn't see any hope for a better tomorrow. I absolutely know some who did. Part of them were farmers, and part of them businessmen even. They went flat broke, and they committed suicide on the strength of it, nothing else. A lot of times, one family would have some food. They would divide, and everyone would share. Even the people that were quite well-to-do, they was ashamed, 'cause they was eating, and other people wasn't. My husband was very bitter, that's just putting it mild. He was an intelligent man. He couldn't see why, as wealthy a country as this is, that there was any sense in so many people starving to death, when so much of it, wheat and everything else, was being poured into the ocean. There's many excuses, but he looked for a reason, and he found one. My husband went to Washington to march with that group that went to Washington, the Bonus Boys. He was a machine gunner in the war. He'd say those damn Germans gassed him in Germany. And he'd come home and his own government stooges gassed him and run him off the country up there with the water hose. Half drowned him. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. He was a hellraiser. I think I've run my race. Peggy Terry's story. I first noticed the difference when we'd come home from school in the evening. My mother'd send us to the soup line, and we were never allowed to cuss. If you happened to be one of the first ones in line, you didn't get anything but water that was on top. So we'd ask the guy that was ladling out the soup into the buckets. Everybody had to bring their own bucket to get the soup. He'd dip the greasy, watery stuff off the top. So we'd ask him to please dip down and get some meat and potatoes from the bottom of the kettle. But he wouldn't do it. So we learned to cuss. We'd say, "Dip down, god damn it." Then we'd go across the street. One place had bread, large loaves of bread. Down the road, just a little piece, was a big shed, and they gave milk. My sister and me would take 2 buckets each, and that's what we lived off for the longest time. I can remember one time, the only thing in the house to eat was mustard. My sister and I put so much mustard on biscuits that we got sick, and we still can't stand mustard till today. There was only one family around that ate good. Mr. Barr worked at the ice plant. Whenever Mrs. Barr could, she'd feed the kids, but she couldn't feed them all. They had a big tree that had fruit in it. She'd let us pick those. Sometimes we'd pick and eat them until we were sick. Her 2 daughters got to go to Norman for their college. When they'd talk about all the good things they had at the college, she'd kind of hush them up, because there was always poor kids that didn't have anything to eat. I remember she was always feeling bad because people in the neighborhood were hungry, but there was a feeling of together. When they had food to give to people, you'd get a notice and you'd go down. So Daddy went down that day and he took my sister and me. They were giving away potatoes and things like that, but they had a truck of oranges parked in the alley. Somebody asked them who the oranges were for and they wouldn't tell him. So they said, "Well, we're going to take those oranges." And they did. My dad was one of the ones that got up on the truck. They called the police, and the police chased us all away, but we got the oranges. It's different today. People are made to feel ashamed now if they don't have anything. Back then, I'm not sure how the rich felt. I think the rich were as contemptuous as the poor then as they are now. But among the people that I knew, we all had an understanding that it wasn't our fault. It was something that had happened to the machinery. Most people blamed Hoover, and they cussed him up one side and down the other. It was all his fault. I'm not saying he's blameless, but I'm not saying either it was all his fault. Our system doesn't run by just one man, and it doesn't fall by just one man either. You don't recall at any time feeling a sense of shame? I remember it was fun. It was fun going to the soup line, because we all went down the road, and we laughed, and we played. The only thing we felt is that we were hungry, and we were going to get food. Nobody made us feel ashamed. There just wasn't any of that. Today, you're made to feel that it's your own fault. If you're poor, it's only because you're lazy, and you're ignorant, and you don't try to help yourself. You're made to feel that if you get a check from welfare, that the bank at Fort Knox is going to go broke. Even after the soup line, there wasn't anything. The WPA came, and I married. My husband worked on the WPA. This was back in Paducah, Kentucky. We were just kids. I was 15, and he was 16. My husband was digging ditches. They were putting in a water main. Parts of the city, even at that late date, 1937, didn't have city water. My husband and me just started traveling around for about 3 years. It was a very nice time. Because when you're poor and you stay in one spot, trouble just seems to catch up with you. But when you're moving from town to town, you don't stay there long enough for trouble to catch up with you. It's really a good life if you're poor and you can manage to move around. I was pregnant when we first started hitchhiking, and people were really nice to us. Sometimes they would feed us. I remember one time we slept in a haystack, and the lady of the house came out and found us, and she said, "This is really bad for you, because you're going to have a baby. You need a lot of milk." So she took us up to the house. She had a lot of rugs hanging on the clothesline because she was doing her house cleaning. We told her we'd beat the rugs for her giving us the food. She said no, she didn't expect that. She just wanted to feed us. We said no, we wouldn't take it unless we worked for it. And she let us beat her rugs. I think she had 1,000,000 rugs, and we cleaned them. Then we went in, and she had a beautiful table full of all kinds of food and milk. When we left, she filled a gallon bucket of milk and we took it with us. You don't find that now. I think maybe if you did that now, you'd get arrested. Somebody'd call the police. The atmosphere since the end of the Second War, it seems like the minute the war ended, the propaganda started in making people hate each other. I remember one night, we walked for a long time, and we were so tired and hungry, and a wagon came along. There was a Negro family going into town. Of course, they're not allowed to stop and eat in restaurants, so they cooked their own food and brought it with them. They had the back of the wagon filled with hay. We asked them if we could lay down and sleep in the wagon, and they said yes. We woke up, and it was morning, and she invited us to eat with them. She had this box, and she had chicken and biscuits and sweet potatoes and everything in there. It was just really wonderful. I didn't like black people. In fact, I hated them. If they just shipped them all out, I don't think it would have bothered me. She recalls her feelings of white superiority, her discoveries. If I really knew what changed me, I don't know. I've thought about it and thought about it. You don't go anywhere because you always see yourself as something you're not. As long as you can say, I'm better than they are, then there's somebody below you can kick. But once you get over that, you see that you're not any better off than they are. In fact, you're worse off because you're believing a lie. And it was right there in front of us. In the cotton field, chopping cotton, and right over in the next field, there's these black people. Alabama, Kentucky, Texas. Never once did it occur to me that we had anything in common. After I was up here for a while, and I saw how poor white people were treated, poor white Southerners, they were treated just as badly as black people are. I think that maybe just crystallized the whole thing. I didn't feel any identification with the Mexicans either. My husband and me were migrant workers. We went down in the Valley of Texas, which is very beautiful. We picked oranges and lemons and grapefruits, limes in the Rio Grande Valley. We got a nickel a bushel for citrus fruits. On the grapefruits, you had to ring them. You hold a ring in your hand that's about like that, and it has a little thing that slips down over your thumb. You climb the tree and you put that ring around the grapefruit. If the grapefruit slips through, you can't pick it. And any grapefruit that's in your box, you can work real hard, especially if you want to make enough to buy food that day. You'll pick some that aren't big enough. Then when you carry your box up and they check out, they throw out all the ones that go through the ring. I remember this one little boy in particular. He was really a beautiful child. Every day when we'd start our lunch, we'd sit under the trees and eat. And these peppers grew wild. I saw him sitting there, and every once in a while he'd reach over and get a pepper and pop it in his mouth. With his food, whatever he was eating, I thought they looked pretty good. So I reached over and popped it in my mouth, and oh, it was like liquid fire. He was rolling in the grass laughing. He thought it was so funny that white people couldn't eat peppers like they could. And he was tearing open grapefruits for me to suck the juice because my mouth was all cooked from the pepper. He used to run and ask if he could help me. Sometimes he'd help me fill my boxes of grapefruits because he felt sorry for me because I got burned on the peppers. But that was a little boy. I felt all right toward him, but the men and the women, they were just spics, and they should be sent back to Mexico. I remember I was very irritated because there were very few gringos in this little Texas town where we lived. Hardly anybody spoke English. When you tried to talk to the Mexicans, they couldn't understand English. It never occurred to us that we should learn to speak Spanish. It's really hard to talk about a time like that, because it seems like a different person. When I remember those times, it's like looking into a world where another person is doing something. This may sound impossible, but if there's one thing that started me thinking, it was President Roosevelt's cufflinks. I read in the paper how many pairs of cufflinks he had. It told that some of them were rubies and precious stones. These were his cufflinks. And I'll never forget, I was sitting on an old tire out in the front yard, and we were poor and hungry. I was sitting there on the hot sun. There weren't any trees. And I was wondering why it is that one man could have all those cufflinks when we couldn't even get enough to eat. When we lived on gravy and biscuits. That's the first time I remember wondering why. And when my father finally got his bonus, he bought a secondhand car for us to come to Kentucky in. My dad said to his kids, "All of you, get in the car. I want to take you and show you something." On the way there, he'd talk about how life had been rough for us. And he said, "If you think it's been rough for us, I want you to see people that really had it rough." This was in Oklahoma City, and he took us to one of the Hoovervilles. And that was the most incredible thing. Here were all these people living in old, rusted-out car bodies. I mean, that was their home. There were people living in shacks made of orange crates. One family with a whole lot of kids were living in a piano box. This wasn't just a little section, this was maybe 10 miles wide and 10 miles long. People living in whatever they could junk together. And when I read Grapes of Wrath, she bought that for me. That young girl there. That was like reliving my life. Particularly the part where they lived in this government camp. Because when we were picking fruit in Texas, we lived in a government place like that. They came around and they helped the women make mattresses. See, we didn't have anything. And they showed us how to sew and make dresses. And every Saturday night we'd have a dance. And when I was reading Grapes of Wrath, this was just like my life. I was never so proud of poor people before as I was after I read that book. I think that's the worst thing that our system does to people, is to take away their pride. It prevents them from being a human being and wondering why the Harlem and why the Detroit. They're talking about troops and law and order. You get law and order in this country when people are allowed to be decent human beings. Every time I hear another building's on fire, I say, "Oh boy, baby, hit him again." I don't think people were put on Earth to suffer. I think that's a lot of nonsense. I think we are the highest development on the Earth, and I think we were put here to live and be happy and to enjoy everything that's here. I don't think it's right for a handful of people to get a hold of all the things that make living a joy instead of a sorrow. You wake up in the morning and it consciously hits you. It's just like a big hand that takes your heart and squeezes it, because you don't know what that day is going to bring. Hunger, or you don't know. Postscript. A sudden flash of memory by Peggy Terry as I was about to leave. It was the Christmas of '35. Just before my dad got his bonus. We didn't get anything for Christmas. I mean nothing. Not an orange, not an apple, nothing. I just felt So bad. I went to the church, to the children's program, and I stole the Christmas package. It was this pretty box, and it had a big red ribbon on it. I stole it off the piano, and I took it home with me. I told my mother my Sunday school teacher had given me a Christmas present. When I opened it, it was a beautiful long scarf made out of velvet, a cover for the piano. My mother knew my Sunday school teacher didn't give me that, because we were living in one room in a little shack in what they call Gander Flat. For a child, I mean, they teach you about Santa Claus, and they teach you all that stuff, and then for a child to have to go to church and steal a present, then it turned out to be something so fantastic, a piano scarf. Children shouldn't have to go around stealing. There's enough to give all of them everything they want, anytime they want it. I say that's what we're gonna have.